A new development in the situation involving Blake Lively is now raising serious questions because newly examined text messages suggest that Taylor Swift may have known about the New York Times article tied to the dispute with Justin Baldoni weeks before it was ever published. And if that timeline is accurate, it could explain why the reaction across Hollywood appeared to unfold so quickly. Now, to be clear, many of the claims connected to the lawsuit and legal complaint remain allegations, and the full picture is still being examined. But the sequence of events is what's drawing attention. Because shortly after the New York Times article appeared, organizations like SAG-AFTRA, industry figures connected to Sony Pictures, and developments involving WME began responding almost immediately. And when those responses are placed next to the timeline suggested in the text messages, the situation begins to look far more complex than many people initially realized. Which brings us to the exchange that's now getting the most scrutiny. A message that appears to show Taylor Swift reacting to the New York Times article well before the public even knew the story existed. And if that message means what some observers think it does, it may change how the entire situation involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the New York Times story is being interpreted. This is where the timeline first begins to attract attention. Because according to the text messages now circulating in discussions about the dispute involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, there is an exchange that appears to suggest Taylor Swift had already seen the New York Times article before it was published. The conversation reportedly takes place on December 5th, 2024. And that date matters, because the New York Times article connected to the situation between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni would not appear publicly until December 21st, 2024. That creates a gap of more than 2 weeks. In the exchange, Taylor Swift reacts to what appears to be the opening of the article, writing that the first paragraph stood out to her. Blake Lively then responds in a way that suggests there may have been earlier drafts or versions of the story being discussed privately. Now, none of this by itself proves how the article was developed. But the timing of the text messages is what many observers started focusing on. Because in traditional journalistic ethics, sources connected to a story typically do not receive full drafts or detailed framing of an investigative article prior to publication. That process is designed to protect editorial independence. So when viewers following the story noticed the December 5th exchange, some began asking a simple question. If Taylor Swift had already seen the New York Times article at that point, how much of the narrative surrounding Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni was already being anticipated behind the scenes? And that question becomes even more interesting when the rest of the timeline is examined. Because shortly after the New York Times article was published, several institutions across the industry reacted almost immediately, which is where the next part of the story begins to complicate the picture. But this is where the timeline begins to tighten. Because once the New York Times article about the dispute between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni became public on December 21st, 2024, the response across several major institutions appeared almost immediate. Within days, organizations connected to the industry began issuing public statements. One of the most notable responses came from SAG-AFTRA, the union representing actors and performers. In a statement provided to The Hollywood Reporter, SAG-AFTRA described the claims connected to the lawsuit and legal complaint as startling and troubling allegations. At the same time, the organization also expressed support for Blake Lively speaking out about concerns related to retaliation and harassment. Now, it's important to emphasize that the union itself acknowledged these were still allegations, not proven findings. But the statement quickly became part of the broader industry reaction unfolding around the situation. Another development involved Vital Voices, an organization that had recently honored Justin Baldoni with the Voices of Solidarity Award for advocacy related to women and girls. Shortly after the New York Times article appeared, the organization announced that the award would be rescinded. Their explanation referenced the communications described in the lawsuit and the PR efforts mentioned in the reporting. And the reaction didn't stop there. The Hollywood Reporter also noted that Sony Pictures, which distributed It Ends With Us, reiterated its support for Blake Lively and stated that it condemned reputational attacks connected to the controversy. When these developments are placed next to the earlier text messages and the timing surrounding the New York Times article, the sequence of events becomes one of the most closely examined parts of the story. because many observers began asking whether the industry response was purely reactive, or whether some of these reactions had already been anticipated. And that question leads directly to another layer of the timeline, one involving public relations efforts, media strategy, and the role of a crisis PR firm. But this is where another piece of the story begins to complicate the timeline. Because alongside the New York Times article, there were also discussions about a crisis PR firm connected to the broader dispute involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. And this is where another name enters the conversation: Scooter Braun. According to references discussed in connection with the lawsuit, Scooter Braun is associated with TAG, a crisis PR company where Melissa Nathan, a public relations strategist, has worked. Now, the involvement of a crisis PR firm does not by itself indicate wrongdoing. These firms are often hired during major public controversies to manage communication and protect reputations. But the reason this detail drew attention is because the PR efforts mentioned in the legal complaint became part of the larger discussion about how the situation between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni unfolded in the media. In some of the commentary surrounding the case, observers pointed out that the lawsuit referenced communications involving publicists, emails, and text messages that were being examined as part of the dispute. And when those communications were mentioned alongside the timeline of the New York Times article, it created another layer of speculation about how information may have moved through Hollywood's media ecosystem. This is also where the earlier text messages involving Taylor Swift began receiving more scrutiny. Because if individuals connected to the situation were already discussing the article before it was published, some viewers following the story began asking whether multiple parts of the industry reaction had been anticipated. Again, none of this establishes conclusions about what ultimately occurred. But it does explain why the discussion around the PR strategy, the media narrative, and the role of public relations firms has become one of the most closely watched aspects of the situation. And that brings the timeline to another turning point, because after the New York Times article appeared and the industry response began unfolding, another major development happened inside Hollywood's talent agency system. But the situation escalated again shortly after the New York Times article became public. Because within the same news cycle, another major development unfolded involving WME, one of Hollywood's most powerful talent agencies. Reports began circulating that Justin Baldoni had been dropped by WME following the publication of the New York Times article connected to the dispute with Blake Lively. And that move immediately became another focal point of discussion across the industry. Because WME represents some of the most influential figures in Hollywood, including Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. So when the agency severed ties with Justin Baldoni, many observers began asking whether the decision was purely a reaction to the allegations described in the reporting, or whether additional pressure had been building behind the scenes. Again, the claims referenced in the lawsuit remain allegations, and the full details of how the agency reached its decision have not been publicly confirmed. But the timing added another layer to the growing timeline, because by this point, several events had already happened in rapid succession. The New York Times article had been published. SAG-AFTRA had issued a public statement. Vital Voices had rescinded the Voices of Solidarity award previously given to Justin Baldoni. And now WME had reportedly cut ties with him as well. When these developments are viewed together, the pace of the industry reaction became one of the most debated aspects of the story, because the sequence appeared to move quickly through multiple parts of the Hollywood ecosystem: media, institutions, and talent agencies. And this is where some viewers following the situation began revisiting the earlier text messages, including the exchange involving Taylor Swift and Blake Lively. Because if the timeline suggested the New York Times article had been discussed privately weeks earlier, then the question many people started asking was whether parts of the industry response had already been anticipated. And that question leads to another layer of the story: the role played by public statements from individuals inside Hollywood. But the reaction inside Hollywood didn't stop with organizations and talent agencies. Soon after the New York Times article appeared, several individuals connected to the industry began issuing their own public statements about the dispute involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. One of the most widely discussed statements came from actress Jenny Slate, who had worked with Blake Lively. In comments reported by outlets including Today.com, Jenny Slate expressed support for Blake Lively, describing her as a loyal friend and praising what she called her willingness to speak out about concerns related to harassment and retaliation. Again, the claims connected to the lawsuit and legal complaint remained allegations, and none of the issues raised had been fully examined through a legal process at that stage. But statements like these contributed to the growing public narrative forming around the story. Other names also surfaced in connection with expressions of support. Reports reference figures such as Paul Feig, the director of A Simple Favor, along with references to other voices in the broader Hollywood community. At the same time, observers noticed that support across the industry appeared somewhat uneven. While some individuals spoke out publicly, others remained silent as the controversy involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the New York Times article continued to develop. And that uneven response became another topic of discussion among viewers following the story. Because by this stage, the situation had already moved through several layers. A New York Times article, text messages raising questions about the timeline, statements from organizations like SAG-AFTRA, industry actions involving WME and Vital Voices, and now public statements from individuals inside Hollywood, which meant the narrative surrounding Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni was no longer confined to a single report or a legal filing. It had become a broader industry controversy, one that continued to evolve as more information surfaced. And that brings the timeline to another moment many viewers noticed. Because as the situation unfolded publicly, some began revisiting earlier events involving media coverage, interviews, and the way the story had first entered the public conversation. And this is where the conversation around the timeline keeps returning to the same point: the text messages. Because as more people began examining the sequence of events involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the New York Times article, that earlier exchange involving Taylor Swift continued to draw attention. In the messages dated December 5, 2024, Taylor Swift appears to react to what seems to be the opening section of the New York Times article. Her comment about the first paragraph is what many viewers immediately noticed, because the article itself would not become public until December 21, 2024. That 2-week gap is what keeps the timeline under scrutiny. Now again, the presence of a text message discussing an article does not by itself establish how the reporting process unfolded. But when observers compare the December 5th exchange with everything that followed, the New York Times publication, the statements from SAG-AFTRA, the decision by Vital Voices to rescind the Voices of Solidarity award, and the reported move by WME involving Justin Baldoni, the speed of the sequence becomes difficult to ignore. And this is why the discussion has increasingly focused on how the media narrative surrounding the situation may have developed. Because once the New York Times article entered the public conversation, the reaction across Hollywood, institutions, and talent agencies unfolded almost immediately. That doesn't necessarily explain why it happened, but it does explain why the timeline itself has become one of the most closely examined aspects of the dispute involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the broader industry reaction. And with the lawsuit, legal complaint, and related communications continuing to be reviewed, many observers say the final interpretation of these events may depend on what additional details eventually emerge, which means the story may not be finished yet. And at this point, the timeline surrounding Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the New York Times article continues to be examined from multiple angles. Because when the sequence is laid out, the December 5th, 2024 text messages, the December 21st, 2024 publication, and the rapid industry reaction that followed, many observers say it raises questions about how the situation developed across Hollywood. That includes the responses from organizations such as SAG-AFTRA, the decision by Vital Voices to rescind the Voices of Solidarity award, and the reported move by WME involving Justin Baldoni. At the same time, it's important to remember that the claims connected to the lawsuit and legal complaint remain allegations, and the full details surrounding the dispute have not yet been resolved through the legal process. But the discussion surrounding the text messages, the role of the New York Times article, and the broader industry response continues to unfold. And as more communications, statements, and legal developments emerge, the interpretation of what happened and who knew what and when may become clearer. For now, the situation involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the wider Hollywood industry remains one of the most closely watched stories connected to this controversy. And many viewers are still waiting to see what the next development might be. If you want deeper breakdowns of the Hollywood disputes, film industry conflicts, and the stories behind major productions, make sure you subscribe and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Because this story is far from over.